In the last hour, in the last 2 hours, BP delays work over Iran sanctions. In the last 4 hours, Moscow warns tough U.S. sanctions would radicalize Iran even more. In the last 6 hours, BP defers work on North Sea gas field as it awaits U.S.-Iran sanctions impact. U.S. threatens Iran with the strongest sanctions in history. Moscow warns against repercussions of tougher sanctions on Iran. London to back its companies against U.S. sanctions on Iran. UK FM U.S. Secondary sanctions is principal red line for Iran. Askari in the last 8 hours. Watchdog, U.S. easing sanctions on Chinese firm may signal path for Iran. Earlier today, Europe moves to protect its companies against U.S. sanctions on Iran. Mike Pompeo threatens Iran with the strongest sanctions in history. Iran condemns U.S. announcement on sanctions yesterday. America threatens Iran with strongest sanctions in history. Iran condemns U.S. sanctions move. The known unknowns of U.S. sanctions against Iran. Iran faces strongest sanctions in history. Pompeo warns Iran of strongest sanctions in history. Just the beginning. U.S. threatens Iran with strongest ever sanctions. Pompeo, U.S. to impose strongest sanctions in history on Iran. Iranian president defiant in response to Pompeo's speech on new sanctions. U.S. vows to impose strongest sanctions in history on Iran. U.S. vows to hit Iran with strongest sanctions in history. Pompeo warns of toughest Iran sanctions. U.S. to Iran, you deserve better, vows new sanctions. Iran and Russia consider using cryptocurrency to evade U.S. sanctions. Report EU to make direct oil payments to Iran to bypass U.S. sanctions. Iran told, comply with U.S. demands or face strongest sanctions in history. Pompeo, U.S. to hit Iran with strongest sanctions. U.S. vows unprecedented sanctions against Iran. Iran's European trade partners supportive steps to tackle U.S. sanctions. Pompeo says U.S. sanctions against Iran can also be used against allies. U.S. to impose strongest sanctions in history on Iran. USA announces new sanctions and pressures against Iran. U.S. threatens strongest sanctions on Iran, seeks sweeping change. U.S. threatens strongest sanctions in history on Iran. U.S. vows strongest sanctions in history on Iran. Pompeo threatens strongest sanctions on Iran. U.S. pledges strongest sanctions in history against Iran. Pompeo threatens Iran with worst sanctions in history. Pompeo threatens Iran with the strongest sanctions in history. U.S. Secretary of State threatens Iran with strongest sanctions in history. U.S.-Iran relations. Mike Pompeo says U.S. to impose strongest sanctions. Swiss firms in Iran fear U.S. sanctions. Brent falls on news of Iran sanctions, as crude prices hold. Major changes needed before U.S. lifts sanctions on Iran. U.S. Secretary Pompeo threatens toughest sanctions in history on Iran. Pompeo vows unprecedented U.S. sanctions against Iran. U.S. threatens Iran with worst sanctions, yet U.S. warns Iran of strongest sanctions in history. Mike Pompeo says U.S. will impose strongest sanctions in history on Iran. Pompeo says U.S. to impose strongest sanctions on Iran. Pompeo vows strongest sanctions in history on Iran. Mike Pompeo threatens Iran with strongest sanctions in history. Pompeo vows strongest sanctions in history against Iran. Pompeo threatens strongest sanctions in history on Iran. Pompeo says U.S. to impose tough sanctions on Iran. Pompeo says U.S. impose strongest sanctions in history against Iran. Pompeo says Iran sanctions to be strongest in history. Iran will face strongest sanctions in history. Pompeo threatens Iran with strongest sanctions in history. U.S. vows strongest ever Iran sanctions. India caught in crossfire of U.S. sanctions on Russia and Iran. Watch live. Pompeo promises strongest sanctions in history on Iran. U.S. sanctions on Iran threaten Chabahar port total to quit South Pars 11 project in Iran if U.S. sanctions not waived. Iran pins hopes on EU measures to get around U.S. oil sanctions from Russia to Iran. India caught in crossfire of U.S. sanctions. Europe plotting to undermine new U.S. sanctions on Iran. Sanctions on Iran may foster alternative trade routes. Global insurers reassessing Iran business in light of sanctions threat.